Jeffrey Haas, in your book, one of the things that caught my attention was you as a law student at the University of Chicago. You were there at the same time that a guy named Ashcroft was there. And when you got your law degree, you went down to Springfield to, I guess, get sort of sworn in or be made an official lawyer. Can you tell us about what happened at that meeting and what that sort of meant for you?
Well, I was a young lawyer. I had actually, because the University of Chicago was sort of a white university in the middle of a black community, I was very conscious of the interaction. And at the University of Chicago, in addition to John Ashcroft, who was sort of a non-entity, if you look at sort of where these people who emerged later were in the 60s, basically they were quiet because they had no following. And I have almost no memory of John Ashcroft, except he played left field and I played right field on the softball team. But another one of my classmates who had a much bigger impact on me was Bernadine Dorn. And she was the head of this organization called the Law School Civil Rights Research Council. LISRIC, right.
I remember.
And Bernadine, actually, through her, I got a job one summer working for a civil rights firm in Atlanta where I grew up, working for two black lawyers who actually my family knew. And so that I sort of traced to some extent my involvement in the movement to that assignment and to seeing what was going on. The anti-Vietnam War movement was at a peak. It was growing. We were watching people being napalmed every day. And the civil rights movement had led to a lot of change, but also a lot of turmoil. While it had helped blacks in the South, blacks in the North, their lives hadn't changed very much. And people were very impatient for it. So I go to get sworn in, having just left law school, and this justice gets up and he says, there's one thing we must fear in the United States. It's the greatest threat to our security. And he went on, and by the end, I didn't know what he was talking about, and he finally said, and that threat is black power. And I was kind of amazed that here I am getting sworn in, and you know, black power meant a lot of different things, and to most black people it meant taking control of their lives. It wasn't an anti-white sentiment, even though sometimes the media and white people saw it that way. So it was an introduction to the law profession, and where certainly a substantial number of legal people stood was represented by this justice.
Jeffrey, can you talk a little bit about I mean, you mentioned black power, and I think the term came out of the Lowndes County Freedom Democratic Party, or which Stokely Carmichael was organizing. The term spread, the concept spread, people embraced it. Talk a little bit about the emergence of the Black Panther Party, how it was formed. I mean, it started in Oakland, but there were people here who were involved in not only SNCC, but the NAACP. You had now Congressman Bobby Rush. Give us the readers, hopefully some people will read quotes, but we're talking listeners here. A little bit of a picture of the emergence of the Black Panther Party in the country and here in Chicago.
Well, I think the Black Panther Party was the sort of a natural outgrowth of the black movement, and Fred Hampton's development followed that. He went from being head of the NAACP and marching for a recreation center and swimming pool in Maywood and for more black administrators. And then briefly he joined SNCC and introduced Stokely Carmichael at a meeting on the West Side. And SNCC, of course, had a position about black power. And again, I've traced some of this back, and I think it's a quote in here by one of the people who was in SNCC. And he said they first arose when Meredith was a march in the South for voting rights. And they put out the term black power, and they were amazed at how it took off. He said nothing since Malcolm X had so energized the black community. And it was at a time where blacks who were attempting to organize in Mississippi weren't seated at the Democratic Convention. There was no place for them in the Democratic Party. And so the idea says, well, we're going to create our own institutions. We're not going to rely on white institutions to empower ourselves. So Fred also began to accumulate a library of black history. That was also part of the Black Power movement. We're proud. We want black history taught in the schools. We want to know what our history. We want everybody to know the contributions that black people have made in this country. And at this particular time, when Bobby Rush was the leader of SNCC in Chicago, and Fred was introducing Stokely Carmichael, for one moment or for brief period, Stokely and Rap Brown, the leaders of SNCC, actually joined the Black Panther Party in California. So when Bobby Rush goes out to California and talks to Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, they say, we should form a chapter in Chicago. And Bobby Rush did, and when he came back, the first person he picked to join, to be part of the Panthers here, was Fred Hampton.
I think it's important to remember that what the Panthers said, which was really an important position for all of the movement, is that they would use the terms black power for black people, red power for red people, brown power for brown people, white power for white people. And and I remember Fred would quote Bobby Seale, where he would say, you don't fight fire racism with more racism. You fight racism with solidarity. You don't fight fire with more fire. You fight fire with water. And Fred, I remember him telling me with a group of people who were becoming Rising Up Angry over at the office on the west side, he kind of evoked those words, saying, I'm not really particularly big on white people, but they're not the enemy, and he always talked about how it was a class struggle.
He did that, and he said, look at what happened in Haiti. Look what happened with Papa Doc. He said they got a black government, they overthrew the whites, and then they had a dictator who was black. So if you don't educate people about socialism, then even if you're successful in a revolution, you're not going to be successful in empowering people. And that was something that Fred and the Panthers were about, and you're exactly right. White power for white people, brown power for brown people. Fred had a little extra thing he threw in there, sort of half jokingly. He said, an X power for anybody I've left out. So
he was an inclusive guy. He tried to get us all involved. In reading your book, Jeffrey, I was a lot of memories came back. I've always been trying to figure out. There is a photograph that's around that had pictures. Bobby Rush is in the picture. Some of the young patriots, the emerging Rising Up Angry, the young lords, and I'm just not sure when that picture. I used to think it was a photo that was taken after Dr. King was killed, but the Panthers weren't an organization then. So I'm not sure what that event was. It was at WTTW. There was a press conference. But in any event, there were a lot of people doing a lot of serious work, and Fred was at the focus of a lot of people's attention. Fred ended up going off to prison for a while, and I remember that he came out of prison, and there was a rally at what was called the People's Church down on Ashland Avenue near Madison, and that was a really a moment that captured a lot of people's attention. Can you give us a little bit of a report about the words that you heard at that rally and kind of what it meant for you?
Well, I was at that rally, and yes, here was this young man he was accused of holding down an ice cream vendor in an ice cream truck and passing out 71 bars of ice cream, $51 worth. And he denied it. But the Hanrahan, who had this war on gangs and wanted to consider
Hanrahan was the state's attorney.
Yeah. Wanted to include the Panthers as a gang. So after Fred was convicted, and the judge wanted to give him probation, there was no violence used. There was a small amount of damage. Fred had no criminal background, and yet the prosecutor urged that he get a heavy sentence. Fred got 2 to 5 years in prison, and he was sent off to Menard. And some of my cohorts at that time went and got an appeal bond for Fred. And so Fred came out, and everybody was waiting to see what he had learned. He had been gone for a few months. And I actually have some of the quotes in my book from that time.